She stood by seat 4A, a pale boarding pass trembling in her hand. Her bright t-shirt and simple skirt made her look out of place among the polished suits. The head flight attendant loomed over her, voice clipped and cold, fingers stabbing toward the aisle. Passengers turned, curious, their whispers cutting like glass. Sophie Carter's chin dipped, but her grip tightened on the pass and her phone. Her father, seated just across, didn't speak, only closed his book with a soft, deliberate snap. That single sound made the air in business class tighten, and something far greater begin to shift. Sophie Carter stood frozen beside seat 4A, the hum of the aircraft's air conditioning whispering around her. Her fingers clamped around a crumpled boarding pass and the slim weight of her phone, as if those two items were anchors keeping her from drifting into the storm that loomed above her. The storm had a name: Lisa Morell, head flight attendant, posture like a ruler, voice clipped with precision that carried just enough volume to ensure nearby passengers caught every word. "This section is for professional travelers," Lisa said, her smile tight, more of a performance than a kindness. Her left hand rested against the seat back while her right arm extended, index fingers stabbing toward the aisle as though it were an escape route. "You'll need to move to a more appropriate seat." Business class was silent for a moment, the kind of silence that prickles along the skin. A suited man in the next row glanced over the top of his newspaper. A woman in pearls tilted her head, eyes narrowing. Sophie's chin dipped instinctively, the brightness of her t-shirt and the plain cotton skirt beneath her light jacket feeling suddenly garish in the muted palette of designer suits and tailored dresses. But her grip on the boarding pass did not loosen. A figure stepped into Sophie's peripheral vision. Antonio, she didn't know his name yet, was an Italian man in his 50s, with an expensive-looking navy suit that had the faint sheen of custom tailoring. He stood awkwardly behind Lisa, eyes darting from the seat to Sophie and back again. His expression was conflicted, the corners of his mouth tightening in a way that suggested discomfort rather than entitlement. Lisa's tone, however, left no ambiguity. "This gentleman has had a long journey. He requires a seat where he can rest properly. Surely you understand that business class isn't the right place for a child." The word "child" landed with the precision of a jab. Around them, the cabin felt smaller, the plush seats and soft lighting turning into a stage. Sophie could hear the faint rustle of fabric as passengers shifted, the quiet click of someone adjusting their seatbelt, the distant clink of glass from the galley. Every sound seemed magnified, feeding her awareness that she was being watched. She wanted to answer, to point out that she had a valid boarding pass for 4A, that her father had booked it for her weeks in advance. Instead, she let the moment stretch, feeling her own heartbeat in her hands. From his seat across the aisle, Richard Carter sat as if carved from stone. The hardback book in his lap remained open, his eyes lowered to the page, though they hadn't moved in minutes. There was no flicker of expression on his face, no visible reaction to the head flight attendant addressing his daughter like an intruder. His stillness was unnerving, but to Sophie, it was familiar. It meant he was watching, weighing, deciding. Lisa mistook that silence for submission. "Go on," she said, as though speaking to a much younger child, her voice now pitched to be heard by the surrounding rows. "There's a seat waiting for you in the back. It will be more comfortable." The pause before the last word dripped with condescension. Sophie's shoulders tightened, but she didn't step into the aisle. She lifted her head just enough to meet Lisa's eyes. "This is my seat," she said quietly. Not defiant, not loud, just steady, each word shaped with the care her father had taught her. A murmur rippled through the cabin. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to pull Antonio's gaze fully onto Sophie, a hint of something like shame crossing his features. Lisa's eyes hardened. "Your seat assignment can be changed if necessary. Please take your belongings." She reached toward the armrest, and Sophie instinctively stepped closer to the seat, clutching her phone tighter. Her boarding pass, slightly damp at the edges from her palm, felt like the last line of defense. "Lisa," one of the younger attendants murmured from behind, her voice carrying a note of caution. She was petite, with a neatly pinned bun and a name tag that read Maya. "Maybe we should check," but Lisa cut her off with a sharp glance. "I've got this." From the corner of her eye, Sophie caught her father's movement. Richard closed his book, not with a snap, but with a measured, almost ceremonial precision. He set it on the empty seat beside him, straightened a cufflink, and pulled a small leather notebook from his jacket pocket. Without looking up, he began to write something down, the pen moving with unhurried certainty. Lisa either didn't notice or didn't care. "Sir," she said, turning slightly toward Antonio, "why don't you make yourself comfortable here while I help the young lady to her seat?" Antonio hesitated, clearly uneasy. "Perhaps." "It's fine," he began. But Lisa was already shifting her stance to usher Sophie away. "I'm fine where I am," Sophie said again, the words softer than before but anchored by the weight of her stance. Her feet remained planted beside 4A. The passengers were no longer just glancing. They were watching openly now, the way people do when they sense something about to tip over into confrontation. Lisa's smile had evaporated, replaced by a mask of professional detachment. "Ma'am, please comply. We have a schedule to maintain." Across the aisle, Richard paused his writing, lifted his head slightly, and looked not at Lisa, not at Antonio, but at Sophie. The message in his gaze was clear. "Hold your ground." Lisa inhaled, clearly preparing to escalate. Sophie could almost see the decision forming behind her eyes, the kind of decision that, once made, was difficult to reverse. She wondered if Lisa realized that every passenger in earshot was now part of this moment, that her voice, her words, were branding themselves into their memory. From the galley came the faint hum of a cart being moved, the smell of fresh coffee drifting forward. It was almost absurd, how normal that scent felt against the tautness of the scene. Lisa gestured again toward the aisle, this time with a sharper flick of her wrist. "Let's not make this difficult." Sophie's fingers tightened once more around her boarding pass and phone. Her father's pen tapped once, twice, against the paper in his notebook. Then he wrote one final word, closed it, and slid it back into his jacket pocket. He leaned back in his seat, crossing one leg over the other, his expression unreadable. And still, he said nothing. The hum of the engines filled the pause. Somewhere in the rear of the cabin, a baby cried briefly, then fell silent. Lisa took a small step forward, the leather of her shoes whispering against the carpet. Antonio shifted back half a step, as though unwilling to be caught in the space between them. The balance in the air was fragile, like a glass of water filled to the brim. One more movement, one more word, and it would spill. Richard reached into his jacket again, not for the notebook this time, but for his phone. His thumb hovered over the screen for a moment before he began to type. The glow of the display reflected briefly in his eyes. Sophie felt a flicker of something in her chest. Relief? Anticipation? She couldn't tell, but she knew somehow that whatever her father was doing in that moment would matter. Lisa, still unaware, straightened her jacket and prepared to speak again. Lisa's gaze was steady, the sort of gaze meant to hold dominance, but Sophie didn't flinch. She took a slow breath, feeling the boarding pass warm in her palm. "This is my seat," she said, her voice low but clear enough to be heard by everyone within a few rows. She held the pass up so that the printed 4A was plainly visible, extending it just enough for Lisa to see without thrusting it forward like a challenge. Her tone carried no edge, no anger, only certainty. The absence of volume made the statement heavier somehow. It was the kind of calm that made people stop mid-thought, realizing they had expected tears or a raised voice and instead had been given neither. From across the aisle, Richard Carter didn't intervene. He simply adjusted the cuff of his left sleeve with deliberate precision, as though the evenness of that small fold mattered more than the scene unfolding 3 feet away. Sophie knew him well enough to recognize the signal. He was not ignoring her. He was measuring the moment, letting it breathe. The tension that had thickened the air in business class began to shift. It wasn't relief. It was awareness. A woman in the second row, dressed in a dove-gray cardigan and pearls, glanced over her shoulder, her brow furrowed in disapproval. Not at Sophie, but at Lisa. Discreetly, she slid her phone out of her purse and held it low, angled just so. The faint red light of the recording icon blinked against the soft lighting of the cabin. Lisa's smile thinned. "Your ticket can be changed, miss," she said, though her voice had lost a fraction of its crispness. She glanced at Antonio, who still lingered awkwardly to her right. "And this gentleman needs a place where he can rest properly." Antonio shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He muttered something under his breath in Italian, but didn't step forward. The look in his eyes made it clear that he wanted no part of the tightening circle of attention. Sophie's chin rose just slightly, enough to reclaim a piece of space in that moment. "I'm comfortable here," she replied, still in that measured, almost gentle tone. From further back in the cabin, a man with silver hair lowered his magazine to watch, his eyes narrowing. He didn't speak, but his expression mirrored that of several other passengers. Discomfort with what they were witnessing. The quiet solidarity in their faces made Sophie's spine feel straighter. Lisa seemed to sense the shift, and for the first time her gaze flickered, not away, but upward, as though she were recalculating. Then she took a half step back, pressing 2 fingers to the discreet earpiece in her right ear. "This is Morel in business," she murmured, her voice pitched just above a whisper but still audible to Sophie and those nearby. "I have a minor in a premium seat. No, not accompanied by another child. Yes," disrupting the quiet standard. The choice of words was surgical. Quiet standard. It sounded official enough to pass as policy, even if it was nothing more than an invention in the moment. Sophie caught the way the woman in pearls frowned harder, her recording continuing without pause. The silver-haired man leaned to murmur something to his seatmate, whose lips pressed into a thin line. The air had shifted again, this time not in Lisa's favor. Richard moved, just slightly, his fingers brushing the edge of the leather notebook still resting on the seat beside him. He didn't open it. Instead, he crossed his legs, one ankle resting neatly over the other knee, his eyes focused not on Lisa, but on the patterned carpet in front of him. Sophie knew that look. It was the same look he wore before making decisions in boardrooms or during late-night calls she wasn't supposed to overhear. Lisa's voice sharpened. "Yes, I understand, but business class is not appropriate for—" Her sentence trailed off when she realized more than a few passengers were now openly watching her. She turned her head slightly, lowering her voice again. The cabin remained hushed except for the muted hum of the engines. The low light from the overhead panels seemed to cast sharper contrasts. Sophie's bright shirt against the muted tones, Lisa's dark uniform cutting into the scene like a shadow. The woman in pearls shifted in her seat, clearing her throat softly, as if to remind Lisa she was on display. From another row, the faint click of a camera app was just audible, a passenger taking still shots, perhaps, to accompany the video. Lisa ended her call with a clipped "understood," lowering her hand from her earpiece. Her eyes settled back on Sophie with a cool detachment. "We'll have this resolved shortly," she said, though her words carried a faint tremor she likely thought no one could hear. Sophie didn't answer. She simply resumed her small, steady breaths, still holding her boarding pass and phone like twin lifelines. In that stillness, she felt the cabin's collective gaze pressing in, not hostile, but expectant, as if everyone knew something was tilting in her favor without yet understanding why. Antonio eased himself a step backward, as though quietly withdrawing from the center of the storm. His hands adjusted the cuffs of his jacket, his eyes now fixed firmly on the floor. Richard remained silent, his attention outwardly fixed on nothing in particular. Yet the subtle shift of his shoulders, the way his right hand rested loosely near his phone, told Sophie he was ready to move if, and only if, the time was right. Lisa's smile returned, but it was brittle. "Enjoy your seat while you can," she murmured under her breath, leaning just close enough that only Sophie could hear. The words might have unsettled her on another day. But now, With the weight of the cabin's attention and her father's measured presence at her side, Sophie felt something steadier take root. She met Lisa's gaze without blinking. Lisa straightened abruptly, glancing toward the galley. "Excuse me," she said, and strode away down the aisle, her heels striking the carpet in clipped, even beats. The hum of conversation began almost instantly in her wake. Low, contained, but undeniable. Passengers leaned toward each other, their words lost in the engine noise but their expressions speaking volumes. Sophie let her grip on the boarding pass ease just a fraction, the paper flexing in her hand. Across the aisle, Richard's eyes met hers for a brief second, and though his face was unreadable, the smallest nod told her everything. "You did well." The woman in pearls stopped her recording, slipping her phone back into her purse with an expression of quiet satisfaction. The silver-haired man raised his glass in a barely perceptible salute before returning to his magazine. For now, the moment was over. But Sophie knew it hadn't passed. It had only been deferred. The quiet was temporary, the kind that comes before a curtain rises. Somewhere in the galley, Lisa's voice was low but sharp, speaking into the crew intercom. The words, "quiet standard" and "inappropriate" floated faintly back to Sophie's ears, enough to confirm what she already suspected. Lisa wasn't done. She was calling for backup, or perhaps just for justification. And when she came back, Sophie knew the next act would begin. From the front of the cabin, Lisa returned with measured steps, her expression smoothed into a mask of professionalism. To the casual observer, she looked composed. But Sophie had already learned to read the tension in the way Lisa's shoulders sat just a little too high. Behind her came Maya, the younger attendant Sophie had noticed earlier, carrying a silver tray with neatly folded blankets. Maya's eyes flicked to Sophie, then to Richard across the aisle, a question in them that she didn't dare voice. Lisa stopped beside seat 4A and turned slightly toward Maya, her tone light but firm. "Maya, please assist Mr. Bellini with his seat." Maya hesitated. "Which seat?" she asked, her voice careful. Lisa's lips curved in a small, humorless smile. "This one." She gestured toward Sophie with the elegance of someone presenting an object rather than a person. "Mr. Bellini has had a very long day. Let's make sure he's comfortable." Sophie's head turned toward the man now stepping fully into view. Antonio Bellini, as Lisa had just named him. He looked every bit the seasoned traveler, with the faint sheen of custom Italian tailoring on his navy suit and the well-worn leather of his carry-on bag. But his expression was anything but entitled. If anything, he seemed embarrassed, his brow knitting slightly as Lisa spoke for him. Before Sophie could answer, Maya took a small step forward. "Ms. Morel," she began quietly, "I think there might be a misunderstanding. This passenger," she nodded toward Sophie, "has a valid boarding pass for 4A. I saw..." Lisa's head snapped toward her with a speed that made Maya's voice falter. The older woman's smile remained, but her eyes had cooled. "Maya," she said softly, the kind of softness that holds a warning. "Remember Section 3.4 of the cabin protocol?" Sophie didn't know what Section 3.4 was, but it worked like a lever. Maya's face tightened, and she shifted the tray of blankets slightly as if to shield herself from the weight of Lisa's gaze. "Yes, ma'am," she murmured, stepping back. Lisa turned her attention back to Sophie, her voice carrying more now, loud enough to spill over the headrests and into the ears of nearby passengers. "Mr. Bellini has been traveling for over 16 hours. He needs a quiet, restful environment, one that business class is designed to provide. It's not an ideal place for children, no matter how polite." The words landed with precision, designed not only for Sophie but for the entire section to hear. Somewhere 2 rows back, a man coughed into his hand, clearly uncomfortable. A woman across the aisle looked down at her hand, twisting her wedding ring. Sophie felt the heat rise to her face, a slow burn that started in her chest and climbed up her neck. She gripped her boarding pass and phone harder, the edges of the paper digging into her palm. Antonio cleared his throat. "It's all right," he said quietly. But Lisa's hand lifted in a subtle motion that silenced him before he could go further. "We appreciate your understanding," she told Sophie, the "we" pointed and deliberate. From his seat, Richard hadn't moved much since Lisa arrived. He sat angled slightly toward the window, the book still in his lap. His eyes dropped to the page for a moment, though Sophie doubted he was reading. Then, with the kind of calm that could only be deliberate, he closed the book. The sound was soft, but in the charged quiet of the cabin, it was louder than it should have been. He placed the book gently on the empty seat beside him, adjusted his jacket, and glanced at the stainless steel watch on his wrist. The faint glint of its face caught the overhead light as his eyes lingered on it a moment longer than necessary. It wasn't a rush. It wasn't even impatience. It was a signal, one Sophie had seen before in different contexts, when he was about to make a decision that others wouldn't see coming. Lisa didn't notice. She was too busy gesturing toward the aisle again, her words smooth but insistent. "Come along now. We'll find you a seat more suited to your needs." The humiliation pressed closer, wrapping itself around Sophie like a heavy coat she couldn't take off. The watching eyes, the subtle shifts of bodies leaning to catch the exchange. It all made the cabin feel smaller, the walls closer. Maya lingered just behind Lisa, her lips pressed into a thin line. Sophie caught her eye for a fleeting second and saw the unspoken apology there. Then Maya looked away, focusing on the blankets in her hands. Antonio shifted again, his discomfort clear. He glanced at Sophie, then at Richard, then back to Lisa, as if trying to decide whether to intervene. But the authority in Lisa's posture was enough to keep him still. Richard's gaze lifted from his watch, crossing the aisle to meet Sophie's eyes. The look was brief, but it steadied her. She didn't move. She didn't answer Lisa's latest prompt. The engines hummed steadily beneath their feet, the sound vibrating faintly through the floor. Somewhere in the galley, a drawer slid shut with a muffled clack. Lisa's smile didn't waver, but there was a hint of strain around her eyes now. "Miss Carter," she said, using Sophie's last name for the first time. "Let's not make this difficult." Sophie swallowed, her throat tight, but her voice steady when she finally spoke. "This is my seat." She raised the boarding pass just enough for Lisa to see it again. The older woman's eyes narrowed slightly, and for a moment, there was no sound at all, just the low thrum of the engines and the distant clink of a coffee cup somewhere in the cabin. Then Richard shifted, leaning back slightly in his seat, his eyes moving once more to the watch on his wrist. The smallest of movements, but to Sophie it was a countdown. Something was about to happen. Richard's hand moved with unhurried precision, slipping into the inside pocket of his jacket. The gesture was so ordinary it might have gone unnoticed, but in the hushed air of the business cabin, every small action felt amplified. When his hand emerged, it held a sleek, black smartphone, the kind without a single scratch or smudge. He turned it once in his palm, then tapped the screen to wake it. The faint glow reflected off his face, highlighting the calm lines around his eyes. Sophie felt her pulse quicken. She knew that phone was not for casual use. When her father pulled it out mid-journey, it was rarely for anything small. Without looking at Lisa, or anyone else for that matter, Richard pressed and held a single contact from his favorites list. The ringing tone was soft, barely audible beyond his seat. But to Sophie, it seemed to stretch each second into something slower and sharper. A click. Someone had answered almost instantly. Richard's voice was low, resonant in a way that carried without rising in volume. "It's me, Flight 882, Seat 4 Alpha." He didn't add his name. He didn't need to. The brief silence on the other end was charged, the kind of pause that suggested immediate recognition. Sophie could see it in the subtle tightening of her father's jaw and the faint incline of his head as he listened. "Yes," he said finally. "There's a situation. I'll hold." He didn't glance at Lisa, but she was already watching him with a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Antonio, standing just beside her, shifted uneasily. His gaze dropped to Sophie and then darted away, as though the mere act of meeting her eyes carried too much weight now. Across the aisle, the woman in pearls sat straighter, her recording phone now resting casually on the armrest, but still angled toward the exchange. 2 rows back, the silver-haired man whispered something to his seatmate, prompting both to look in Richard's direction. Maya, hovering just behind Lisa, fidgeted with the edge of the blanket on her tray. Her eyes darted between Richard, Lisa, and Sophie, as though trying to piece together what she was seeing. She had worked in business for 3 years and had never once seen a passenger make a call like that mid-flight, not without explaining themselves, not without permission. Richard's voice came again, still measured, still calm. "Understood. I'll wait." He ended the call with a light tap, set the phone face down on the armrest beside him, and folded his hands loosely in his lap. The entire exchange had taken less than a minute, but it left a ripple in the cabin's atmosphere. It was subtle at first, a quiet shift in posture, the way people glanced at one another when they thought no one was looking. The murmurs began, just a few at first, then growing into a low hum that matched the steady drone of the engines. "What was that?" someone whispered in the second row. "Who did he call?" came the hushed reply. Lisa cleared her throat, straightening her spine as though to reclaim control. "All right," she said briskly. "Let's continue with the seating adjustment." Her tone had lost its earlier warmth, replaced with an edge of impatience. But she didn't move forward immediately. Something in Richard's demeanor, calm, unbothered, as if he had already set something in motion, had made her wary. Antonio shifted again, his discomfort now obvious to everyone. He rubbed the back of his neck and glanced at the empty seat across the aisle, his brows knitting. "Perhaps we don't," he began, but stopped when Lisa's eyes snapped to his. The murmuring continued, low and persistent. Sophie could feel it pressing in from all directions. Strangers were speculating about her father, about what he had just done. She heard snippets. "Looks military. Could be an inspector." He didn't even say his name. Richard, for his part, sat in quiet repose, eyes fixed somewhere beyond the window as if nothing of consequence had just happened. Sophie knew better. He was waiting. And when he waited like that, it was never in vain. Lisa made a small motion toward Maya, a flick of her hand that was meant to be discreet, but failed. "Bring Mr. Bellini's bag forward," she instructed. Maya hesitated, glancing at Sophie. "Are we sure?" "Yes," Lisa cut in sharply. "Now." Maya bit her lip, her eyes dropping. She turned to retrieve the bag, though the reluctance in her movements was obvious. Sophie's stomach tightened. A flicker of hope she hadn't even realized she was holding on to began to dim. Her father's call had been like a flare in the darkness, but now, nothing was happening. The aisle remained crowded, Lisa still in control, Antonio still awkwardly positioned like an invited guest at the wrong table. The seconds stretched. No new voice came over the intercom. No urgent footfalls from the cockpit. Nothing. Around them, the cabin's energy began to shift again, curiosity giving way to impatience. A man 2 seats ahead sighed audibly. Someone else adjusted their seat with a sharp click. Lisa caught Sophie's gaze and allowed herself the smallest of smirks, as though to say, "Whatever you thought that would do, it didn't." Richard didn't look at her. He didn't look at anyone. But Sophie noticed the faintest twitch of his finger against his leg, a tell she recognized from years of quiet observation. He was counting time. Lisa turned back toward Antonio, her professional smile back in place. "Shall we?" she asked, gesturing once more to the seat. Antonio hesitated, his discomfort now bordering on visible refusal. Maybe it's fine," he said in halting English. "It's not necessary." Lisa's smile sharpened. "It's already arranged." But just as she reached for the armrest of Sophie's seat, Richard's phone, still face down, buzzed once. A short, discreet vibration. He didn't reach for it. He didn't need to. His eyes met Sophie's, steady and calm, as if to say, "Not yet." And then, nothing. The moment stretched into silence, the hum of the engines filling every gap. No one moved. The vibration of Richard's phone had barely faded when a chime rang through the cabin. A soft, pleasant tone meant to precede announcements. All eyes turned upward toward the overhead speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen," the voice of a different crew member began, "please remain in your seats for the next few minutes as we adjust cabin weight distribution. Thank you for your cooperation." The announcement was routine enough, delivered with a casual professionalism, but in the tense quiet of business class, it felt almost like a non sequitur. Passengers shifted in their seats, murmuring, wondering if the instruction was related to what they'd just witnessed. Sophie's heart lifted slightly, thinking this might be the first sign of her father's call taking effect. But the words themselves, weight distribution, seemed far removed from the confrontation at seat 4A. The hope dimmed as quickly as it had risen. Lisa seized on the distraction, her heels clicking softly against the carpet as she stepped closer. "Miss Carter," she said, her voice firm but not loud. "Let's go ahead and move you now. We don't want to delay the adjustment." Sophie's fingers tightened around the boarding pass in her phone. The thin rectangle of paper was warm against her palm, the edges soft from being held so long. She could feel the eyes of the cabin on her, their curiosity still sharp. Lisa extended her hand toward the armrest, her nails neatly manicured, the movement smooth and deliberate. "Come on," she urged, the edge in her tone returning. "Your new seat is ready." But Sophie didn't move. She stood anchored beside the chair, her shoulder almost brushing the headrest, her chin slightly lowered. She didn't look at Lisa. She looked straight ahead, past the rows of seats, to the closed door of the cockpit. The hum of the engines filled the pause between them. Somewhere behind, a fork clinked softly against china, the faint scent of brewed coffee drifting forward from the galley. Lisa's hand hovered for a moment, then withdrew, her smile tightening. "I'd prefer not to involve the captain in a seating matter," she said lightly, though her eyes betrayed the hint of a dare. Across the aisle, Richard remained still, his gaze distant, as though he were watching something far beyond the confines of the aircraft. But Sophie knew he was aware of every word, every movement. He didn't need to speak to make himself present. His silence had weight, a kind that could press into the air until everyone felt it. Maya lingered a few steps back, the folded blankets on her tray now nothing more than an excuse to stand nearby. Her eyes flickered between Sophie and Lisa, the tension in her posture betraying her reluctance to interfere again. "Miss Carter," Lisa tried once more, her tone dropping into something colder. "Please take your seat in economy now." "I don't want to repeat myself." Sophie's heartbeat thudded in her ears, but her voice, when it came, was steady. "This is my seat." The words were quiet, but they cut through the murmuring around them. Antonio, still awkwardly positioned to the side, shifted his weight, his gaze fixed on the carpet. He looked as though he wanted to vanish. Lisa exhaled through her nose, a subtle flare of impatience. She stepped back, glancing toward the galley, as if weighing whether to escalate further. Then Sophie noticed it, a faint blink of amber from the corner of her vision. She turned her head slightly and saw it. The small rectangular light above the galley door was flashing. The signal wasn't for passengers. It was for crew, a silent request for immediate attention. Lisa caught it too. Her eyes darted to the light, then back to Sophie, as if debating whether to ignore it. The blink continued, slow and deliberate. The murmuring in the cabin quieted as the door to the galley opened. One of the senior attendants leaned out, her expression unreadable, and nodded toward Lisa. "You're needed up front," she said simply. Lisa's brow tightened, but she pasted on her professional smile again. "Excuse me a moment," she told Sophie. Her voice clipped now, the edges no longer softened. She walked toward the galley, her heels making muted thuds against the carpet. The moment she disappeared inside, Sophie's gaze drifted back to the cockpit door, still closed, its matte surface giving nothing away. The cabin remained in its peculiar suspension, no resolution, no clear sign of what her father's call had set in motion. The passengers were caught between curiosity and anticipation, their attention flicking from Sophie to Richard to the blinking galley light. Then, as if in answer, a new sound cut through the steady hum of the engines, the mechanical click of a lock releasing. The cockpit door handle shifted, and the heavy panel began to swing outward. The cockpit door opened with a heavy, deliberate swing, its motion somehow louder than any sound it made. Every conversation in business class fell silent as a tall man in a crisp navy uniform stepped through, the gold stripes on his epaulets catching the soft cabin light. His cap was tucked neatly under one arm, his polished shoes making no sound against the carpet. Captain Harris. Sophie read the name on the small brass badge pinned above his breast pocket. Paused just inside the cabin, his eyes scanning the rows in a slow, deliberate sweep. When his gaze reached Sophie's row, it stopped. He walked forward with a measured pace, each step heavy with the kind of authority that didn't need to be announced. Passengers instinctively leaned back in their seats as he passed, as if giving space to a tide they couldn't stop. Lisa, emerging from the galley just in time to see him approach, straightened abruptly, her professional smile snapping into place like a mask.
"Captain,"
she began warmly,
"I was just—"
But Harris raised one hand, palm out, halting her mid-sentence. "Ms. Morrell," he said, his voice deep and steady, "you and Ms. Clark, please step away from service immediately." The words struck the air like a sudden drop in cabin pressure. Maya, who had been hovering near the galley, froze. Lisa blinked once, then twice, before her smile stiffened.
"Sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding. This passenger,"
she gestured toward Sophie,
"has been disruptive to—"
The captain's gaze cut to her like a blade. "Step away from service," he repeated, each word measured. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The silence around him carried it further than volume ever could. Lisa's mouth opened again, but before she could speak, Harris shifted his weight slightly, his presence pressing down like gravity. "I will not repeat myself." Maya looked between them, her eyes wide.
"Sir, I—"
"You too, Ms. Clark," Harris said without turning his head. "Both of you are relieved of duty until further notice. Please stand aside." The two women exchanged a glance. Lisa's face tightened in anger, but Maya's shoulders sagged with a mixture of relief and dread. Slowly, they stepped back toward the galley, the click of Lisa's heels sounding sharper now, edged with humiliation. Harris didn't watch them go. Instead, he turned to a nearby attendant, an older man with silver hair and a calm, unreadable face. "Mr. Patel, I need access to the seat reservation log for this flight, the boarding gate CCTV from Rome, and the unaccompanied minor manifest." Patel didn't hesitate. "Yes, Captain." He turned toward the galley and was gone. The murmurs among the passengers began again, softer this time, like the first rumbles of an incoming storm. Sophie could feel their eyes on her, but they weren't the same as before. The pity and curiosity were gone, replaced with something more watchful. Lisa, half hidden in the galley, couldn't stay silent. "Sir," she called, her tone straining to stay professional. "This is an overreaction. I was enforcing standards. Business class has a—" "Business class," Harris cut in, his tone cooling the air, "has no standard that allows discrimination against ticketed passengers, especially minors. And you will not speak until I have reviewed the records." The weight of the captain's voice pressed the words into the air like metal being stamped. Antonio, still awkwardly standing to one side, shifted his stance and raised a hand slightly, as if seeking permission to speak. "Captain, I didn't—" Harris gave him a brief nod. "Mr. Bellini, please return to your assigned seat. You are not at fault here." Antonio's relief was visible. He inclined his head toward Sophie, almost a bow, before retreating down the aisle, his steps quick, eager to be away from the heat of the moment. Richard hadn't moved through all of this. His posture was as still as it had been when he first closed his book. His eyes tracked the captain's movements without expression, as if cataloging each decision. Sophie could feel the calm radiating from him, a silent counterpart to the captain's active authority. Within moments, Patel returned, carrying a slim tablet. He handed it to Harris without a word. The captain scrolled through the seat log with practiced efficiency, then turned the device so the screen faced the nearby rows. "Seat 4A, he read aloud. "Reserved and confirmed under passenger Sophie Carter. Paid in full. Ticket issued 3 weeks prior to departure." He tapped again, bringing up a still image from the boarding gate's CCTV feed. The frozen frame showed Sophie, boarding pass in hand, stepping onto the jet bridge. The timestamp was precise. "Manifest of unaccompanied minors," Harris continued, "lists Sophie Carter, accompanied by legal guardian in adjacent seat 4B, as authorized to occupy business class." He lowered the tablet, his gaze returning to Lisa. "Do you dispute any of this?" Lisa's lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment she looked as though she might argue. Then her eyes dropped. "No, Captain." The quiet that followed was absolute. Even the usual hum of the engine seemed muted, as if the aircraft itself were listening. Harris handed the tablet back to Patel, who stepped aside. "Very well," the captain said, his voice resuming its measured cadence. "You will remain off service for the remainder of this flight. Further review will be conducted upon landing." Lisa's jaw tightened, but she inclined her head slightly. The gesture more forced compliance than genuine respect. "Understood," she said, though the word tasted bitter. Harris turned back to Sophie. His eyes softened just enough to take the edge off his authority. "Miss Carter, is everything all right now?" Sophie nodded once, her voice quiet. "Yes, sir." He gave a single nod in return. "Good. Please remain in your seat. If you require anything, let Mr. Patel know." Richard inclined his head slightly, an almost imperceptible acknowledgement. The captain had just begun to turn back toward the cockpit when a chime sounded, different from the routine announcements, sharper, more urgent. A small light above the forward galley blinked twice in rapid succession. Harris paused, one hand on the back of a seat. Patel stepped closer. "Captain, it's ops control," he said in a low voice. Harris's brows drew together. "Patch it through." Patel reached for the cabin phone, pressing a sequence of buttons before handing the handset to the captain. Harris held it to his ear, his back straight, his expression unreadable. "This is Harris." A beat of silence, then his jaw tightened slightly. "Understood. I'll address it." He lowered the phone slowly, his gaze shifting briefly toward Richard before settling somewhere in the middle distance. Whatever had just been said, it wasn't routine. He handed the phone back to Patel, gave a short nod, and started toward the cockpit without another word. The passengers watched him go, the heavy door swinging shut behind him once more. The cabin was left in a stillness that buzzed with questions, none of them answered yet. The captain had been gone only a few minutes when the chime for the intercom sounded again. This time not for passengers, but for crew. The voice that followed was calm, but carried the weight of authority. "Attention all cabin crew. Per Captain Harris, we are initiating an urgent review of a potential passenger discrimination incident. Effective immediately, the Dignity First protocol will be enacted in business class." The words hung in the air like a gust of unexpected wind. Sophie had never heard the phrase before, but judging by the ripple of reactions around her, neither had most of the passengers. Only Maya, still standing near the galley, showed a flicker of recognition, followed almost instantly by unease. The announcement continued. "As this is a beta stage procedure not yet released to the public, all interactions in this cabin will be documented and reviewed. Passengers are asked for their patience and cooperation." A murmur rose and fell among the rows. Sophie could feel the shift. No longer just curiosity, but a kind of quiet vindication from those who had watched the earlier exchange. Lisa, still seated near the galley door under informal watch by Mr. Patel, kept her gaze fixed forward, her face blank. Antonio reappeared from his seat a few rows back, walking toward Sophie with hesitant steps. He stopped beside her row, one hand resting lightly on the headrest in front of her. "I want to apologize," he said, his voice pitched so the surrounding passengers could hear. "I should not have allowed myself to be part of that misunderstanding. I am sorry for any embarrassment to you." Sophie looked up at him, surprised. His eyes were steady, not defensive. She gave a small nod. "Thank you," she said quietly. Her father's gaze flicked toward Antonio for a brief moment, then returned to the page of the book he had reopened. No judgment, no further acknowledgement, just the same unreadable composure as always. The mood in the cabin might have settled into a quiet, satisfying order if not for the faint, artificial brightness of a phone screen 2 rows back. A man in his 30s, wearing noise-canceling headphones around his neck, angled his phone toward himself and spoke into the camera with the ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times. "And here's the so-called injustice," he was saying, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Kid in a t-shirt taking up premium space while a paying business traveler gets bumped. Make of it what you will." Sophie caught the tail end of his words and felt her stomach tighten. The man turned the camera briefly toward her, catching only a narrow frame. Her bright shirt, her boarding pass in hand, Lisa standing over her earlier. Then back to his own face. "Entitlement looks different these days, doesn't it?" he added before ending the recording. It took less than 5 minutes. The man's phone pinged with rapid notifications, and whispers began to thread through the cabin. Sophie could see other passengers glancing at their own screens, some frowning, others smirking. Across the aisle, the woman in pearls who had recorded the full interaction muttered something under her breath and began scrolling quickly through her own video gallery. She tapped at her phone with urgent precision. Sophie didn't need to see the man's feed to know what was happening. She'd seen it before, clips cut and spliced until the story they told had little to do with reality. The air shifted again, this time less comfortably. Passengers who had been openly supportive minutes earlier now wore guarded expressions, as if reserving judgment until they knew the full story. Maya's knuckles were white where they gripped the edge of her tray. She looked toward Sophie with an expression halfway between sympathy and fear. Sophie realized the young attendant wasn't just worried for her. She was worried about becoming collateral damage in something spiraling far beyond an aisle confrontation. Richard hadn't moved, hadn't looked up, hadn't shown a flicker of reaction to the shifting undercurrent in the cabin. His stillness was so complete it was almost disorienting. For a brief moment, Sophie wondered if anyone else noticed how deliberate it was, how much it unsettled people expecting some kind of defensive outburst. The blogger, who by now Sophie recognized as a minor internet celebrity, smirked at the growing notification count on his screen. He adjusted his seating position with an exaggerated sigh, as though basking in his own relevance. Maya stepped forward, lowering her voice to Richard. "Sir, I think that passenger is misrepresenting—" Richard looked up just long enough to meet her eyes. "Don't," he said softly, the single word carrying enough weight to still her instantly. She stepped back, her throat working as she swallowed whatever else she'd been about to say. Sophie saw the tremor in her hands as she adjusted the blankets again, a nervous habit she'd had since the beginning of the flight. The moment held, taut and uneasy. Outside, beyond the oval windows, the sky was a smooth expanse of pale blue, the kind of calm that belied the turbulence gathering inside the cabin. Somewhere forward, near the cockpit, the faint chime of the crew intercom sounded again. Sophie saw Patel lean toward the handset, listening, then glanced toward Richard. The look was fleeting, but it was there, a flicker of recognition, maybe even deference. The noise of the passengers dulled as the tension settled again, but Sophie could feel it, like the moment before a second wave breaks. Her father still hadn't said a word. The chime that signaled incoming crew messages was sharper this time, urgent enough that even the most distracted passengers glanced toward the galley. Mr. Patel, still stationed near the forward service area, stepped aside to receive a printed slip from the purser on duty. The slip wasn't long, just a few lines, but whatever was written there made his eyebrows lift ever so slightly. He didn't keep it to himself for long. Walking to the center of the business class cabin, he cleared his throat and addressed the passengers in a voice pitched to carry without shouting. "Ladies and gentlemen, the airline CEO has issued an internal directive regarding the earlier incident. Effective immediately, 2 crew members have been placed on temporary suspension pending investigation." The words were diplomatic, but everyone knew exactly who he meant. Lisa's jaw clenched so hard Sophie could see the muscle move from 3 rows away. Maya's eyes widened, her relief tempered by the knowledge that she, too, had been named earlier, though perhaps spared this time. Patel continued. "Furthermore, an audit of all premium cabin procedures will be conducted across the airline's global network, with immediate review of bias-related policies." A murmur rippled through the cabin like a low wave. Sophie caught snippets. "Finally! About time! This is serious." Even the silver-haired man across the aisle allowed himself a satisfied nod. But the wave was followed quickly by a countercurrent. From the rear galley, a different voice, low but firm, began to filter forward. It was one of the senior attendants speaking into the crew comm system, but this time their words were echoed on a small, tinny speaker near the service area. "Union leadership has been informed," the voice said crisply. "They object to any suspension enacted solely on the basis of passenger-recorded video. We have been instructed to prepare for potential job actions, including rolling service delays or refusal to crew flights, until due process is guaranteed." The phrase job actions landed with a thud in Sophie's gut. She didn't have to be an insider to understand the implication. Walkouts, sudden scheduling gaps, possible cancellations. It wasn't just about Lisa anymore. The ripple had reached the shoreline of the airline's entire workforce. Lisa's eyes regained a glint of defiance, as though the union stance had given her a lifeline. She sat straighter in the jump seat near the galley, no longer avoiding the gaze of passengers but meeting it with a faint, cool smile. The passengers reacted less uniformly now. Some frowned at the idea of suspensions being reversed. Others muttered about fairness. The tension in the air was jagged, pushing up and down in uneven beats. Through it all, Richard remained exactly as he had been. Book open, eyes lowered, one ankle crossed over the other. Sophie couldn't tell if he was actually reading or simply letting the pages turn under his gaze, a practiced pose for moments when others were losing their footing. Then, without warning, he reached into his jacket pocket. The motion was slow, almost casual, but Sophie recognized it instantly. The phone again. He unlocked it with a thumbprint and typed a short, precise message. She leaned slightly to glimpse the screen, not enough to intrude, but enough to see 4 words appear in the text field. No headlines. Fix the process. He sent it without a second glance at the recipient. No name showed on the screen. Only a number, unlabeled but clearly stored from long before. The phone vibrated once in acknowledgement. Richard slid it back into his pocket, leaned back in his seat, and resumed his quiet posture. Sophie's mind spun. Who had he sent that to? The CEO? Someone in government? Whoever it was, her father had bypassed the noise, the social media chatter, the union outrage, the simmering cabin politics, and gone straight to the core of the problem. Maya hovered uncertainly nearby, her tray now empty. She looked like she wanted to say something but thought better of it. Sophie could see the fine tremor in her fingers, the product of too much adrenaline and too little certainty about her own future. The cabin settled into an uneasy rhythm. The occasional ding of a passenger calling for service, the rustle of newspaper, the subdued conversations held behind raised hands. But the air felt charged, as though all of them were sitting inside the eye of a storm. Then, the sound came, distinct from all the rest. A sharp, insistent ring from the cabin phone mounted on the bulkhead near the galley. Mr. Patel moved quickly to answer it, his tone low and formal. "Yes, Patel speaking." A pause. His posture straightened. "Understood. I'll put him on." He covered the receiver with one hand and looked toward the cockpit, then toward Captain Harris, who had re-emerged briefly from behind the closed door. "Sir," Patel said, "it's the FAA liaison." They've asked to speak with you directly." The reaction was subtle but unmistakable. Harris's shoulders squared, his expression tightening in a way that signaled both attention and caution. FAA calls in-flight were rare, exceptionally rare. The captain took the handset without another word, his voice low as he greeted the caller. Sophie couldn't hear the conversation, but she could see the shift in his posture, slightly forward, intent. The passengers sensed it too. Conversation stopped again, the collective attention narrowing to that single point in the cabin where authority and mystery converged. Whatever this was, it had just moved beyond the jurisdiction of an airline. Captain Harris ended the call with the FAA liaison in the same unhurried way he had begun it. No raised voice, no visible tension. Just the steady, controlled presence of a man accustomed to high-stakes conversations. When he handed the handset back to Mr. Patel, the cabin's collective attention lingered on him, hungry for context that he didn't offer. Instead, Harris approached Richard's seat. He leaned slightly, just enough so their voices could be exchanged without becoming public property. "They asked me to thank you," he said, "and to confirm you still want no name attached." Richard's eyes didn't lift from the book he'd opened again, but the faintest crease at the corner of his mouth could have been a smile, or simply the acknowledgement of a shared understanding. "My name stays out of it," he said evenly. "You know the policy." Sophie's pulse quickened. "Policy?" Harris gave a slow nod. "Understood. I'll handle the optics." He stepped back, returning to the cockpit, leaving Sophie with more questions than answers. The questions didn't stay unanswered for long. Maya, her nerves still visible but softened by curiosity, lingered closer to Sophie's row. She kept her voice low. "I didn't know your father was that Richard Carter." Sophie turned to her, brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" Maya glanced around before leaning in. "Before I worked for this airline, I studied aviation law for a year. There was a panel, FAA advisors, on passenger safety. They had a task force for minors traveling alone or in premium cabins. Richard Carter wrote most of the protocols. People in the industry call him the architect of the Child Dignity Guidelines." Sophie blinked, her mind fitting the pieces together. "And now?" "Now," Maya said carefully, "he's one of this airline's strategic investors. Not a figurehead, not a board seat photo op. Someone who actually shapes policy, which is why it's unusual that he's letting this play out quietly instead of using his name to crush it." The truth settled over Sophie like a weighted blanket, not heavy with dread, but with the awareness of unseen power. Her father wasn't silent because he was powerless. He was silent because he chose precision over spectacle. As if on cue, Mr. Patel returned to the front of the cabin holding a tablet. He tapped the PA system, and a calm, authoritative voice filled the air. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to inform you that our airline is immediately rolling out a fast-track retraining program across our entire network within the next 72 hours. All crew will complete 2 mandatory e-learning modules, anti-bias in premium cabins and child dignity protocol." The reaction was immediate. A wave of quiet approval from some passengers, visible discomfort from others, particularly those who had sided with Lisa earlier. Sophie saw the woman in pearls exchange a satisfied glance with the silver-haired man. From the corner of her eye, Sophie caught Lisa's reaction. She sat rigid in the jump seat, hands folded, eyes fixed forward. Her face was impassive, but the faint tightness around her mouth betrayed her. The announcement continued. "This action is part of our commitment to ensuring all passengers, regardless of age or appearance, receive equal respect and care." Maya glanced at Sophie again, almost smiling now. "That's him," she whispered. "He's just fixed the system without ever putting his name in the press release." Sophie looked toward her father, who remained absorbed in his book, the only sign of attention the slight stillness in the turning of his pages. The cabin began to relax, the earlier tension dissolving into low conversation, but the reprieve was short-lived. The central flight display screens, mounted above the aisle for passenger information, flickered then switched to the live flight map. The line of their route arced smoothly toward their destination, but a patch of yellow and orange cloud mass was building ahead. A small turbulence icon flashed near it, accompanied by a soft chime. Passengers glanced upward, murmuring. Sophie felt the small shift in the cabin's atmosphere, the subtle way unease could creep in when weather became part of the equation. Lisa's eyes flicked toward the display, and for the first time in nearly an hour, Sophie saw a spark of calculation there. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but enough to register. Maya followed Sophie's gaze and seemed to think the same thing. She leaned in just enough for Sophie to hear. Bad weather is tricky. It can be spun a dozen ways if someone's looking to rewrite the story. Sophie didn't need to ask what she meant. If turbulence disrupted service or forced seat changes, Lisa could frame it as a logistical necessity all along, painting herself as the one who'd been following procedure under weather constraints. Her father kept reading. But Sophie had seen this rhythm before, quiet before a countermove, and something told her the game wasn't over yet. The turbulence icon blinked again on the map, steady as a heartbeat. The turbulence icon on the flight map kept blinking, but the cabin's real disturbance was brewing not in the skies ahead, but on countless phone screens. In the space of 30 minutes, the chopped live stream from the blogger 2 rows back had ignited into a trending wave. The hashtags were swift and sharp. #premium seat privilege, #entitled travel, #business not babysitting. Each one carried a bite, pushed by viewers who had only seen 20 seconds of footage. Sophie, bright shirt visible, clutching her boarding pass while Lisa's voice, cut and rearranged, implied she was refusing to cooperate. Sophie sat still, staring at the seat back ahead. She could almost feel the heat of a million unseen eyes judging a story that wasn't the truth. Her hands tightened on the boarding pass again, though she no longer needed it. Across the aisle, the blogger wore a smug half-smile, scrolling his feed like a man watching his own fireworks show. Every refresh brought more likes, more comments, feeding the distorted narrative. But narratives, Sophie would learn, can turn just as quickly. The pivot began with a single notification tone from a woman's phone. One Sophie recognized as belonging to the pearl-wearing passenger in row 2. The woman scrolled briefly, then tapped, then nodded to herself with the calm satisfaction of someone who'd just found the trump card. She stood, not abruptly, but with the slow grace of someone who knew all eyes would follow, and addressed Patel quietly. He leaned down, listened, and then beckoned her toward the galley. Within moments, her phone was connected to the crew system, the full-resolution video playing on a private screen. The footage was longer, steadier, untouched by edits. It began with Lisa's first approach to Sophie, the full context of her words, the steady way Sophie had said, "This is my seat," without defiance, and the passenger's growing discomfort. By the time the video reached the moment where Captain Harris intervened, there was no mistaking who had acted with dignity and who had not. Patel's eyes narrowed, and he nodded once. The woman returned to her seat, her phone still in hand. Moments later, the full clip appeared online from her verified account, tagged simply, "Respect passengers." The shift was almost physical. Sophie could feel the current of online chatter begin to change as the hashtag climbed. People who had been condemning her minutes earlier were now questioning the first clip's validity. Comments flipped from "she should move" to "unacceptable behavior from crew" in a matter of refreshes. The blogger's smirk faltered. He scrolled faster now, jaw tightening as his own comment sections began filling with links to the full video. A few seats away, the silver-haired man chuckled quietly into his folded hands. Maya, who had been watching the exchange with attention that seemed to knot her shoulders, finally exhaled. She disappeared into the galley, and when she emerged a few minutes later, she held a folded piece of paper, handwritten, not typed. She found Patel first. "Can this be logged with the captain's incident file?" she asked, her voice lower than usual. Patel glanced at the page, read for a few seconds, and then looked up at her with something like respect. Yes, he said simply. It will be attached to the record. Sophie's curiosity won out. As Maya stepped past, she tilted her head enough to read the first lines. We belong to the service of dignity, not the service of procedure. I take responsibility, alongside my colleagues, for forgetting that today. It was signed simply, Maya Clark, flight attendant. The admission was small in scale, perhaps, but in the closed ecosystem of an aircraft cabin, it was seismic. It wasn't a public statement. There were no cameras, no hashtags attached. It was, in its way, a mirror held up to the crew itself. Maya tucked the paper into Patel's hand and went back to her tasks without fanfare. Sophie saw the faint tremor leave her shoulders, replaced by the steadiness of someone who had said what needed to be said. Outside the windows, clouds thickened, the first light bumps of turbulence rolling through the cabin. Passengers reached for armrests or tightened seatbelts. The weather icon on the map flashed again, accompanied by a gentle chime from the cockpit advising that service might be delayed. Lisa sat motionless in her jump seat, her eyes on the forward bulkhead, hands clasped. But every so often, Sophie caught her glancing toward the galley door where Patel had disappeared. 15 minutes later, Captain Harris reemerged, a sheet of paper in his hand. He didn't announce anything to the cabin. Instead, he stepped into the galley and handed the page to Patel, who read it quickly, his eyes flicking to Lisa, then to Maya, then back to the captain. Patel's expression shifted into something more formal, more final. He refolded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. Only Sophie, seated close enough to see, caught the brief exchange of words between the captain and Patel. Confirmed? Confirmed. The rest of the cabin might never know exactly what had just been decided, but Sophie didn't need the details to guess. The last line on the memo, printed in stark, unambiguous text, had been visible for a moment as Patel folded it. Summon Ms. Morel upon landing. Terminate if verification holds. It wasn't loud. It wasn't public. But it was the kind of justice that, once in motion, didn't stop. The plane gave a mild shudder as it entered the edge of the weather system, the seatbelt sign glowing amber above every row. Outside, the light dimmed as clouds thickened, the world beyond the windows blurring into soft gray. In the cabin, the conversations quieted again, not out of fear of turbulence, but in anticipation of what they now suspected was inevitable. The weather eased before it became more than a series of mild bumps, the turbulence dissolving into the low, constant hum of engines. But the real change in the cabin was not in the air currents. It was in the tone. The arguments had subsided. The once skeptical glances had turned into nods toward Sophie, some subtle, some openly supportive. The earlier fracture in opinion had mended into something approaching unity. About 20 minutes before descent, Patel reappeared from the galley with a slim black folder in his hands. He moved directly to Richard's row, leaning in just far enough to keep his words private. "Sir," he said, "the CEO has requested an in-flight sign-off on an amendment to crew service policy. They've named it the Carter Charter. Dignity First is to be the headline. You're listed as its originator." Richard closed his book gently, as if marking a sentence worth returning to. "I told them not to use my name." "They know," Patel replied, "but they want your acknowledgement. It's going to every crew station worldwide before this flight lands. They've built in a measurement system, NPS-style scoring for passenger dignity. It will count toward crew KPIs." Sophie tilted her head slightly to listen without drawing attention. The words dignity and KPI didn't usually live in the same sentence, but here they sounded like they belonged. Richard accepted the folder and scanned the single-page charter. It was plain, direct. The Carter Charter. Dignity First service shall honor the dignity of all passengers, regardless of age, appearance, or status. Crew performance will be measured in part by passenger feedback on dignity, weighted equally with safety and efficiency. Breaches will result in formal review and, where appropriate, disciplinary action. Beneath the text were 3 signature lines: CEO, Flight Operations Head, and crew representative. The CEO and operations head had already signed in neat, digital script. The last line was blank. Waiting. Patel glanced toward Maya, who was standing near the galley door, unsure if she was supposed to step forward. "They'd like her to sign as the cabin crew representative," Patel said. Maya's eyes widened. "Me?" Richard's gaze followed Patel's. "Why not you?" Maya hesitated only a moment before walking forward. Her hands trembled as she took the pen from Patel, but when she wrote her name, the strokes were steady. The ink shone briefly before drying into permanence. Patel closed the folder and secured it. "It's official now," he said quietly. "Before we land, every crew member in the network will see it in their briefing inbox." Sophie felt something warm settle in her chest, not the vindication of someone punished, but the deeper relief of knowing something had been built to last. Richard leaned back in his seat, looking almost finished with the matter, but Patel lingered. "Sir," he said carefully, "the CEO also authorized compensation, a credit, upgrades for future flights, public apology, whatever you'd like." Richard shook his head once. "No." "No?" Patel echoed, surprised. "Discipline the right person. Fix the process, that's all," Richard said. His tone was even, but final. "No headlines, no checks, no seat in the front row at some press event. If it works, they'll forget my name. That's how I want it." Patel nodded slowly, as though committing the words to memory. "Understood." The descent began soon after, the plane angling gently downward toward a hazy skyline. The seatbelt sign glowed amber again, and the crew moved through the motions of final checks. Sophie felt the change in pressure in her ears, the shift of the engines into a lower hum, as the wheels touched the runway with a smooth, rolling thud. The cabin seemed to exhale. Passengers unclipped belts, retrieved bags from under seats, and began the familiar shuffle toward the aisle. Sophie stayed seated, watching the slow progress of the line toward the forward door. When it was their turn, she and Richard stepped into the narrow space just before the exit. The jet bridge stretched ahead, the muted light of the terminal filtering through its panels. And there, leaning against the wall just inside the bridge, was Lisa. Her uniform was immaculate, her hair still perfectly arranged, but the composure was gone. Her eyes were red, her shoulders slightly hunched. She didn't look at Sophie immediately. When she did, it was without the steel edge she had worn for most of the flight. She began, then stopped, swallowing hard. Sophie waited, unsure if Lisa was about to defend herself, apologize, or say nothing at all. Richard's gaze was on Lisa now, steady but not cold. Lisa's eyes dropped. "I don't have an excuse," she said quietly. "I just don't want to leave it like that." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. She stepped aside, giving them room to pass, but her expression lingered between defeat and something like hope. For the first time since the flight began, Sophie saw her not as the gatekeeper of a seat she had tried to take, but as a person standing on the edge of losing everything she'd built. Whether she would fall or be offered a hand was a choice yet to be made. The air in the jet bridge was cooler than the cabin, tinged with the faint metallic smell of the terminal beyond. The hum of the aircraft's engines was replaced by the low murmur of airport sounds. Rolling luggage, distant announcements, the shuffle of shoes on industrial carpet. Lisa stood there still, shoulders not squared but drawn slightly inward. She glanced at Richard, then at Sophie, as if unsure which one to address. It was Sophie who stepped forward first. She wasn't sure why, perhaps because she'd been the one standing in seat 4A, the one who'd felt the weight of Lisa's words in front of a watching cabin. Lisa's voice was low, almost hesitant. "I wanted to say I'm sorry. To you. Not because someone told me to. Just because I am." Sophie didn't speak right away. She looked at Lisa's face, not the rigid mask of authority she'd worn earlier, but a face marked by the strain of the last few hours. There was no performance left in it. "Thank you for saying it," Sophie said at last. Her voice was steady, neither warm nor cold, but it carried the weight of sincerity. Lisa blinked, as if the words were not what she'd expected. Her mouth twitched into something halfway between relief and disbelief. She gave a small nod, then stepped aside fully, leaving the path clear. Richard's gaze lingered on Lisa for a moment, unreadable as ever, before he placed a gentle hand on Sophie's shoulder and guided her forward. The terminal was busy, but as they emerged from the jet bridge, the passengers from their flight seemed to part instinctively. No one clapped, no one called out. The respect was in the silence, in the way people stepped aside without needing to be asked, creating a quiet corridor for Sophie and her father to walk through. It wasn't an aisle of applause. It was something deeper. The woman in pearls gave Sophie a small, knowing smile as she passed. Antonio, now back in his travel composure, inclined his head in a brief bow. Maya stood just inside the gate area, her uniform still neat despite the day, and offered a subtle nod, more a salute of shared understanding than anything formal. Richard didn't acknowledge them openly, but Sophie knew he'd registered each gesture. His stride remained steady, unhurried, as though this was simply the natural way to exit a flight. Beyond the gate, the world resumed its usual rhythm. Families greeting each other, business travelers rushing toward connections, airport staff moving with practiced efficiency. But somewhere, in the invisible network of messages and meetings that kept the airline running, the ripple of what had happened on Flight 882 was already taking form. By the time Sophie and Richard reached the baggage claim, the airline's internal communications team had pushed a bulletin to every employee inbox. Subject: New Mandatory Training Initiative, effective immediately, content. Following the review of an in-flight incident on Flight 882, the airline will roll out the Dignity First training series across all departments. Modules include anti-bias in premium service and child passenger dignity protocol. All staff must complete training within 30 days. Leadership will monitor NPS dignity scores as part of performance evaluations. There were no names in the bulletin, no passengers, no crew singled out. But everyone who had been on the flight would know the story behind it. Sophie read the email over her father's shoulder as they waited for their suitcase to appear on the carousel. "They really did it," she said quietly. Richard didn't look up from the phone in his hand. "Processes change faster when you make the right call to the right person," he said, "and when you don't waste time on noise." She thought back over the sequence, the humiliation, the silence, the single phone call, the captain stepping out, the system moving not in bursts of drama but in deliberate, unshakable steps. From being shamed in public, to silence, to one call, to the entire airline rewriting how it treats its passengers. It wasn't the kind of ending with cheering or headlines, but as Sophie realized, it didn't need to be. The point wasn't to win loudly, it was to win in a way that stayed won. Their suitcase arrived. Richard lifted it easily, adjusting the handle to match Sophie's height as they began walking toward the exit. Behind them, the crowd from their flight began to filter into the baggage claim area, blending back into the anonymity of travel. The story, for most of them, was already fading into memory. But for Sophie, and for the airline, it would remain in a different form. Policy, training, and the quiet knowledge that one moment of standing firm could shift an entire system. They stepped out into the cool air of the pickup zone. The sound of rolling wheels on concrete replaced the murmur of the terminal. A black sedan pulled up, its driver stepping out to load their bag. As Sophie slid into the back seat, she glanced once over her shoulder toward the terminal doors. Lisa was nowhere in sight. The jet bridge, the aisle, the confrontation, all of it was already receding, becoming part of the day's long shadow. But the feeling remained. Dignity restored, not with fanfare, but with the quiet force of doing the right thing and making it impossible to undo.